Right, welcome back everyone to Author Story. I am your host, Alexander Lim, and our featured book for this episode is God and Love on Route 80, The Hidden Mystery of Human Connectedness, which you can check out by clicking the Amazon link in the video description below. The author, Stephen G. Post, is a public speaker, researcher, and professor who has taught at the University of Chicago's Medical School and is the founding director of the Center for Medical Humanities, Compassionate Care, and Bioethics at the Stony Brook University School of Medicine. He is also an author, and God and Love on Route 80 is his latest work. So, Stephen, welcome to Author Story. Thank you very much for being with us.
Well, it's good to be with you, Alex. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Great. So first off, Stephen, a little bit about yourself. What was it like growing up as Stephen? I mean, I know for one thing you were an A student, but what is it like for you growing up?
Well, I grew up pretty simply. I grew up in New York on the Long Island South Shore. I like to sail and clam, and went off to a high school, a prep school in New Hampshire called St. Paul's, which was an Episcopal school. And I was happy to get off Long Island and meet a lot of nice people up there. But basically, I've always been a pretty simple person. I don't have expensive tastes. I've always been a good student. I've been pretty much on the spiritual side.
Right.
And that's really where the story starts.
Right. And because we're talking about the spiritual aspect here, were you a member of any organized religion while you were a kid? I mean, were you brought up in any particular faith?
Yeah, I was. I was raised Roman Catholic, but then when I was 13, I went off to an Episcopal school, as I mentioned. And so for a while, I still went to Catholic church in Concord, New Hampshire, with a few other Catholics. But I more or less became an Episcopalian and have remained so.
Okay. Now, because we've got listeners all over the world, for the benefit of those who aren't familiar, what is the difference between, say, an Episcopalian and a Roman Catholic?
Well, the Episcopal Church is basically the American version of the Anglican Church, and the Anglican Church is pretty much the UK version of the Catholic Church.
Oh, okay.
It just doesn't worry about Rome and popes. It was part of the Reformation, but in terms of liturgy and the Mass and so many other elements, it's very Catholic. Although the priests get married typically and have families and live normal lives in that sense.
Okay, all right, I got that. So basically, what you're telling me is, this is probably the kind of track expected from a middle class kid. I mean, high grades in school, then you go to high school and college, then you go on to a job and career in some corporation, and then it occurs to me that something happened to put you in your present path, and I think you refer to this your Blue Angel dream. So what is this dream and what is it all about?
Well, that's exactly right, Alex. So I was 15 and I was really interested in spiritual classics, Eastern and Western, as a high school student. I took a lot of classes in spirituality and religion up there. And when I was 15, I had a dream. It was just early in the morning. I was kind of asleep, but not quite asleep, sort of awake too, but not quite awake.
Right.
I had this really vivid dream that recurred about a half a dozen times over, something like a year and a half. And it was amazing. And I wasn't a big dreamer. I didn't believe in angels, but I would see this very thick, silvery gray mist, and it would be covering this mysterious road to the west, leading I knew not where. And then I saw a face to my left, the face of a youth with stringy blonde hair leaning out over a ledge somewhere as if to jump.
All right.
And then the mist dissipated, and there was the face of a blue angel. And in a feminine voice, it said to me, "If you save him, you too shall live. And then the dream ended. Okay. So I would have sort of written this off, put it on the shelf as, the result of a dyspeptic hot dog, or maybe off demerits in the sun.
Right.
But the thing is that it recurred a half dozen times or so, and so I started talking about it with some of my friends after I'd had the dream. We had required chapel service at 8 in the mornings. I typically go early and just meditate on it. And I had a great theology teacher named Rod Wells, who was an Episcopal priest and a good friend of the Buddhist Alan Watts. And he took an interest in adolescent spirituality. He didn't just write it off as a bunch of gobbledygook from immature minds, but he kind of believed in it. Uh-huh. So he'd been to Yale Divinity School, and so one afternoon, Rod and I drove from Concord down to New Haven, Connecticut, and I was the centerpiece of a class on adolescent spirituality at the Yale Divinity School with a Jungian professor named James Ditties, and they asked me, about 15 of these students training for ministry, they asked me about the dream and what it meant to me, and I said, look, up in New Hampshire we will read Ralph Waldo Emerson's essay on the Oversoul, but nobody really believes it, although I do. Most people just think it's nice literature, but for me, this idea that there is one mind, one original mind that we all participate in, and that our minds are not just cooked up from our brain cells and tissues and biology, that there's something more mysterious and universal about mind and that we participate in it. I said, that's something I believe in. And the dream to me was just this infinite mind trying to break through my consciousness and my barriers to suggest to me that maybe, just maybe, there's something more to it, a kind of a mystery to human connectedness that I don't fully understand. And so that was great. And then they asked me, well, what did I do? Any actions based on the dream? I said, I applied to Reed College in Portland, Oregon, which was out in the West, and no kids from St. Paul's ever applied out there, and they were kind of shocked. But that was basically what happened, and people knew about it. I talked about it, and so I didn't have the dream after I was about 16 or 16 and a half, but it was still a part of my consciousness, and I continued to wonder about it and so forth.
Okay, and as you mentioned, this thing was a persistent dream, right? It happened several times.
Yeah, half a dozen times, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Was it exactly the same each time?
Always exactly the same, and that was the strange thing about it. I figured that, dreams can be just like, you're anxious about something, and so you cook up a dream, and it's just really, it's not too striking, but just kind of reflects your emotional state, and maybe there are other kinds of dreams, but this was a very distinct, vivid, exact dream, and I wondered if it was some kind of a message from a higher presence in this universe, but I wasn't at all sure. And I was, and I realized that, young people go on desperate detours looking for meaning, and maybe my mind was just, concocting this because that's the way human beings are. They're always desperate for something meaningful.
Right, okay. I just like to go on a sidebar over here. Maybe you can help explain this. Is there any difference between spirituality and religion?
Well, yeah, I think a lot of people are not part of formal religious structures, but they would still refer to themselves as being spiritual, as having an inner presence, an inner sense of the divine presence. The Bible says the kingdom of heaven is within you. Do you not know that you are God's temple and God's Spirit dwells within? They have this sense of an inner presence, and they have a sort of a namaste sense of the spiritual dignity of other people, and they treat them accordingly. But they just may not be doing this in the context of a formal religious organization. On the other hand, you can be religious and you can be very spiritual. In fact, I resist the idea that somehow religion is just formality. It can become more of a formal kind of routinized type experience. But I think oftentimes it's just people being spiritual together in a way that kind of, emphasizes certain messages and experiences.
Okay. Well, yeah. Okay. So thanks for that. Thanks for that definition. Okay, so Stephen, the road trip. I mean, this is the subject of the book, and this essentially, from what I understand, is defining the journey that, as well, set you on your present road to life. When you
Yes.
started off on the road trip, did you start it with any plans, or did you just go where the wind blew, so to speak?
I had no plans. I mean, the bottom line is, so Rod Wells had gotten me a job. When I was up in New Hampshire, I tutored French Canadian kids, and I liked that a lot. There was a little school across from St. Paul's on Pleasant Street, the Millville School, and I enjoyed that. It was very gratifying. And so when I was 17, I was home. It was summer. I had a job tutoring in the Bronx, and my mom and dad really put their feet down. They said, no, the Bronx is too dangerous. You can't do this. And we got into quite a brouhaha, an argument for a couple of days. And ultimately my mom actually said, look, I'm not going to support your college at Swarthmore if you insist on this. And that was pretty serious. And so I relented and I said, okay, so what am I going to do this summer? And my dad was the president of a furniture store on Fifth Avenue called W&J Sloan's. It was kind of a well-known store in its day. Mm-hmm. And he knew all the manufacturers around greater New York. They did lamps and desks and chairs and all kinds of things.
All right.
So he came up with the idea, well, why don't you work at Bill DeBono's lampshade factory? And I'd met Bill DeBono, actually. So for 2 weeks, I drove out to Patchogue, Long Island, in my dad's secondhand gray Mercedes 190, which was the backup car. And I worked cutting cardboard. It was really hot. There was no air conditioning. It was between two huge Italian women, respectfully stated. Lots of sweat and lots of cigarettes and Bill DeBono staring over me, supervising my cardboard cutting. And after 2 weeks, it was a Friday night. I just drove that Mercedes out to West Hampton Beach, which is a little further out east. It's kind of a town that young people like, and I had some friends there from school. I had my classical guitar. I had my copy of Siddhartha, and I had about $50 in my pocket. About 11 at night, I said to a couple of friends, I'm not really interested in going to college anymore, and I'm not going to work in this factory, and I think I'm just going to do something a little crazy. I'm going to follow my dreams. So we said goodbye, and I drove west.
Okay.
Through Manhattan, over the George Washington Bridge, and then there were two signs there. I'd never been over the bridge before. Uh-huh. And one said 95 South, the other said 80 West, and I followed Route 80 West. And when I was in the middle of Pennsylvania at 5 a.m, I was thinking of turning back, having doubts about it. And if I went back now, my reputation would be untarnished. But lo and behold, as if God intervened, the generator on this Mercedes broke down, and that meant that all the power stopped, the engine stopped, and I was just able to get over on the shoulder. And I could have said, well, that's a sign that somehow I shouldn't take this journey, but to me it was a sign that I should. So I did. There were no telephone booths. It was miles and miles and miles of wheat fields in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania area. And so I took out a piece of paper from the glove compartment and wrote a note that said, to the Pennsylvania State Police, please return this car to Henry A.V. Post, 44 Davison Lane East, West Islip, New York, 516-669-5655. That's the phone number. From his son, Stephen, who no longer works in the lampshade factory.
Okay.
And that was really, I know it was bad. This is kind of a confession. But anyway, I was a kid. So I took my guitar and my Siddhartha and my $50 and put my thumb out, and immediately a big white truck came along, and a guy named Gary flung the door open. He was all country and western, very, very Christian. And he said, where are you going? I said, west. He said, well, I can get you to Chicago. And we were off to Chicago.
Okay. And from there, I mean, where did you reach? I mean, where did the journey eventually end up?
Well, I ended up, I did call my mother from Lincoln, Nebraska. I said, "Hi, Mom,
Okay.
collect." And she said, "Oh, thank God you're alive. We can call off the Pinkertons. The Pinkertons are
Okay.
detectives." So
Right.
I said, "Mom, why did you call the Pinkertons? Didn't you get my note?" That was a terrible thing to say too. And she said, "We got the car back. We should have let you tutor in the Bronx. It would have been a lot easier." And then I said, "Well, do you have George Lamont's address?" He was a cousin of mine who was in Vietnam for a couple of tours of duty, and he lived in the Mission District of San Francisco. So I went out and I lived with cousin George that summer, and I played classical guitar in Hispanic bars and restaurants, and there was a temple on the street corner of Market and Chenery. It was a Nichiren Shosho Buddhist temple where they chant Nam Myoho Renge Kyo with beads. I hadn't done that, but I fell into that group and I loved it, and it was like very mystical. And so I was happy. But toward the end of the summer, I drew a really bad draft number, and I'm not totally anti-war, but I didn't want, some wars I don't like, and Vietnam is one of them. So I called the people at Reed College, because I turned them down, and I said, "Look, could you open a spot for me? Because I just want to, stay out of this situation." And they said, "Okay." So about 7 a.m, early September, with an old Japanese guy named Gus, who was my mentor that summer, and a bunch of temple people and cousin George. They gave me a Gohonzon, which is a Japanese scroll, like a holy Buddhist scroll, put it in my backpack after they explained it to me, and I took the bus down Market Street and another bus toward the Golden Gate Park, and I walked across the park, and that's like a pretty good walk, and like 20 minutes or so, maybe even half hour. And then I started walking up the Golden Gate Bridge, and I was on the left. There's a pedestrian walkway, and it was silvery gray. I could only see about maybe 2 to 3 feet in front of me, but that was okay. And I got to the middle of the bridge. There's like a big, huge single span there, and I heard this sort of shuffling noise to my left, and I looked, and I faintly made out the facial contours of a young guy with stringy blonde hair who looked shockingly like the person I'd seen in my dream. So he saw me, and he was kind of leaning over, but he saw me over his shoulder, and I said to him, I truly hope that you're not planning to jump. And he just reacted. I'd interrupted him, and he was indignant, and he started screaming out over the water passages from Macbeth, life is empty nothingness. And I said, "Hey, it's that way for a lot of us, and we're all looking for meaning, and I could be out there and you could be here, and it wouldn't make much difference." And I said, I want you to just kind of pause a little bit, because I may have come all the way across the country on Route 80 just for this meeting with you. And I said, it's the weirdest thing imaginable, but you look like a kid I saw in a dream. And I explained the dream, and Yale, and Bill DeBono's lampshade factory, and running off with Dad's Mercedes 190, and the generator, and the whole 9 yards. And he said, "You're crazier than I am." I said, "Well, I'm not sure about that, because I'm not actually out on the ledge. But I'll tell you what, this is, I'm shortening this, but if you come over the railing, there was a rail that was about waist high. Now it's like chest high, because they don't want too many people jumping off the bridge.
Right,
it's kind of a hot spot for suicide folks.
Right.
So I said, if you come over the railing and stand here next to me, I'm going to give you something that will turn your whole life around. And I said, it's called a Gohonzon. And he said, "What's that?" And I explained, it's this scroll. And I pulled it out of my backpack. And I said, what they tell me is that if you have this, you're going to get a lot of good fortune the rest of your life. And nobody should give it away. But, I might even give it to you. So very slowly he came over the railing and stood next to me, and I unscrolled this thing and I explained some of the symbols, universal mind, human oneness, and such things, and he was kind of interested in it, and I said, look, I want you to at least experiment with this. I'll give this to you, but you have to make me a promise. You have to, and we also chanted a couple of lines of Nam Myoho Renge Kyo over the San Francisco Bay, and I said, I'll give you this, but you have to promise me that you'll walk, down the bridge, which means south, and cross over the Golden Gate Park and get this bus and that bus and make your way to my cousin George's. And I gave a note to him, and cousin George, this is Harry. Please let him sleep on your floor where I was sleeping. Introduce him to Gus down at the temple. Just take care of him and see if you can help him get it together.
Right.
And he needs a shower.
Right.
And so we parted ways, and Harry walked south, I walked north, and I felt, I actually got to the north end of the bridge and put my thumb out, and this small farmer's truck came by, and an old guy opened the door, and he said, where you go? And I said, Oregon. That's where Reed College is, Portland, Oregon. And he said, well, I can get you most of the way. My name's Dwayne Dill, D-I-L-L, just like in dill, pickle. And here's my wife, Dorothy. And she waved, and I got in the car, and I was off. But, I felt that was a very incredible moment of synchronicity and spirituality for me, because I was amazed that somehow or another, even though I'd had that dream a couple of years earlier, at least initially,
Right.
And so that was like, a while ago. And even though it was basically 3,000 plus miles away from Concord, New Hampshire to
Right.
San Francisco,
Right.
that somehow this dream had been in a really uncanny way, sort of premonitional, and also, kind of suggested to me that, there really is an oversoul, that my mind is more than my mind, that we have this gift of oneness at a mind level, at a level of spirit and soul, and that this was all set up in this incredibly uncanny way by a cherishing, whatever you want to call it, supreme being, ultimate reality, God is fine, but that somehow this had been set up, and so I could learn a lesson about the nature of love and ultimate reality.
Nice. And would you say that this was the incident where you realized that everything is connected to the infinite mind, as you would call it?
Oh, yeah. It was really crucial to me. I mean, and so when I was at Reed College, I was even taking courses like, Alchemy 101, sort of the history of medieval science coupled with quantum theory,
Right.
People like Jobs were floating around, it was an interesting era. But, but then there's the second episode. Really, the book is it's really not a memoir. It's a set of about a dozen really astonishing events of synchronicity that proved to me growing up that there is this kind of one mind that Larry Dossey and Deepak Chopra and others talk about. And so it was like late January. I'm sitting in the coffee shop. It doesn't snow in Oregon, but it rains like crazy a lot of the time. And it does get slushy and cold. And this guy, about 9 o'clock, he comes bounding through the doors of the coffee shop, and we're all sitting there, and he says, my name's Andy. Who wants to go for a ride on my new Harley Davidson? And like a fool, I said yes, and I went out there, and I jumped on this thing, and I grabbed this guy's black leather jacket, and it turns out he was completely crazed and out of his mind. And he hit 140, went through every red light, every stop sign in Portland. He headed out for 101, the Pacific Coast Highway that I'd taken up from the bridge, and he lit out south. He hit 150, 160, even 170 miles an hour at one point, and I was freaking out. We were slipping and sliding on the slush, and I really thought I was dead, and I was even crying, and I was begging him to stop and turn around. and he was just laughing into the rain, like he was just totally torched. And eventually he did a U-turn over the Midway about an hour later, and he went back, same super speeds, and he dropped me off right where he picked me up in front of the coffee shop. So I got off the bike and I was staggering. I had kind of lost my sense of balance, but I walked across this bridge over the ravine to the dormitory. It was called Ackerman Dormitory. And so as soon as I walked into the dorm, I crossed the threshold of the main door, and then there's a common room there with a payphone on the wall on the right. And I tell you, Alex, I never answered that phone ever. Just not something I did, because I was hard to track down, and I had given my mother the number, but I just never answered it. But for some reason, now remember, it's 11 at night in California, so it's 2 in the morning in New York, and I just picked up the phone. I said, hello, and it was my mom. And she said, thank God you're alive. And she'd been asleep, but she'd had a premonition and a lot of fear and anxiety in her sleep, and she woke up and she thought I was dead. And so she explained that to me, and I said, well, Mom, I thought I was dead too, honestly, but I guess not quite. But anyway, something happened, because, you're 3,000 miles away, and, somehow or another you picked up on this. And so my mom was a little bit of an Irish mystic, I think, and she could appreciate this, and this kind of connectedness between moms and sons. And it's not that uncommon. These premonitions really do occur. And, so that equally convinced me that there is this mystery of human connectedness, and we do participate in this infinite mind before matter, that everything derives from mind, that mind isn't just derived from brain and tissue and matter, but that mind is unique and beyond space and time, and that mind is a loving mind, a mind of pure, unlimited love, and we can connect with it, and when we do, we can flourish and be happy and know that we are guided in this life. And I've been, since those early days, I've been guided in the most unusual ways, and my whole life has really, in a sense, been a journey on Route 80. But I've taught at, great universities, great medical schools. I even quit a career in immunology. I was at UPenn for a while, and following the dream, I went to the University of Chicago Divinity School to get a doctorate in psychology and religion, and study with Mircea Eliade and Joseph Campbell and all these great people who wrote about, journeys and shamans and so forth. And I've just had a charmed life. I've encountered so many people, and I still think of myself. People ask me, hey, where are you from? And with a kind of a light laugh, I say, well, you really want to know, Route 80.
Okay. All right. Cool. So, Stephen, given the nature of the book, I guess it's inevitable that something like it would come out. And you were the guy who wrote this particular book. Was writing the book something that kind of grew over the years, or was that something that happened to make you think, I really should write this thing?
Well, it's interesting. In 1999, I chaired a conference at MIT on empathy, altruism, and agape love, and brought together a lot of scientists and theologians, spiritual thinkers. It was funded by Sir John Templeton, who by that time was my mentor and great friend. He was a major investor and philanthropist who's passed away now. And we brought people like Jean Vanier and Cicely Saunders, the founder of the hospice movement, and L'Arche and so forth. We brought them, and we asked people, look, take all your scientific knowledge and let's figure out how we can really understand people who are just amazingly loving, almost beyond the human capacity, it would seem. And so we had a great conference, and then a year later, I was in my office at the medical school at Case Western. I got an email from Sir John. He lived down in Lyford Key in Nassau, and said, Stephen, we need to start an institute that will study not just human love, but the love that made humans. Not just human emotion, but this sort of uncanny sense that somehow there is a greater love in the universe, and we can experience sometimes directly in these mystical moments, or sometimes through others, because they're just the perfect people at the perfect time in the perfect place, and they have the perfect gifts to get us out of a jam. And so I faxed back, Sir John, what should we call this? He said, let's call it the Institute for Research on Unlimited Love. And then because I was at the medical school and I was actually studying Alzheimer's a lot at the time, so I had some trepidation. I said, in my next fax, I said, Sir John, maybe we should call it the Institute for Creative Altruism. He faxed back, no, unlimited love up to $8.9 million. And I faxed back, I love that language. It jumps right off the page. Alex, you'd have done the same thing. Most of your listeners would. And he was completely right, because the love language is the language of spirituality and religion. And it created a tremendous upsurge. But when I founded the Institute as a nonprofit, I put out an electronic newsletter, and I started monthly putting out little vignettes on God and love on Route 80, just to explain to people kind of, who I was and why I got here, and even all the synchronicities of meeting Sir John, which I won't go into. So I started writing bits and pieces of it, reflecting on these events. But I kind of dropped it because, I got busy, and I moved locations from Cleveland to New York, and I had a lot of responsibilities administratively. But about 4 years ago, I decided, I really want to finish this up, especially because I'd had an event where I thought I could bring this to a useful crescendo as the end of a larger narrative, and that was filling the UN on World Youth Day with kids who had written essays about how they pushed back against pressures to be hateful of those who didn't agree with their beliefs, and that's a long story in itself. Right. But the main thing was that I began to pull it back together and collate it and sort of just kind of play with the style and figure out, throughout the book I refer to myself as the boy. And I do that for a lot of reasons. One, they called me the boy when I was at St. Paul, so it made sense. But also, I wanted to convey that, even though we get older in life, there's still a child within, and it also made it available. Like almost anybody could be the boy or the girl or whatever, and so it kind of opened it up for other people to connect with it.
Okay, and I guess from there, that's how the book sprang then over several years of this process, putting it together.
Yeah, and I rewrote it, I really had to work hard on the style because it wasn't academic book. I've written, a lot of academic books and scholarly articles, right. Hundreds, but this is a book about a spiritual journey, and it had to be inspiring and it had to be uplifting, and so I feel comfortable having written it, and I'm grateful that I could really make a record of these amazing experiences I've had.
All right, nice, cool. Okay, so Stephen, in the last minute or so of this interview, just to wrap up, are there any last words of wisdom you'd like to share, maybe to inspire our listeners?
Yeah, well, I have a favorite quote.
All right, go ahead.
So, my favorite quote is from Eleanor Roosevelt. I guess this makes me a little old-fashioned. But she said, the future belongs to those who believe in the beauty of their dreams. And when I was a 15-year-old kid, I had this pretty unusual dream. And honestly, I was a good student. I was, pretty average kid. And I had this dream that kind of broke into my life, and I wondered about it. I wasn't sure if it meant anything, but somehow or another, because there was the right pull of the dream, but also the right push, all of this was synchronicity. It was all the way God wanted it to happen. I was moved out to the West, and I encountered Harry on that bridge, and from that moment on, I've just been a noticer. I like to say that word, noticer. Larry Dossey uses it a lot in his book, One Mind. but just to be aware of the winks and the whispers and notice these things in your life, because, a lot of times we get weighed down, and life is a battle. It can be brutal. It can be so disappointing. The losses can be so profound, and you can just lose all of that sense of enchantment. But don't lose it, because if you just stay spiritual and pray and meditate and be hopeful, be open to surprises, things will break through, and you'll realize that all things, my favorite passage from St. Paul, Romans 8:28, all things work together for good for those who love God and abide in God's purposes. Well, that's conditional. You have to love God. You have to cultivate a spiritual path. But if you do that truly, no matter what difficulties arise, you will be blessed, and you will be smiling, and you will stay on Route 80. And that's what I want everyone to do. And I want them to be freed so they can talk about this and not be inhibited by, physicalists and materialists. I've been in medical schools, Chicago, Ann Arbor, Michigan, Case Western Med for 20 years.
Right.
And the assumption is, well, if you're a scientist, you have to be a materialist, right? And if you're not, there's something wrong with you. You're not, you got a loose screw. But that's really not true. And so what I find is that a lot of people, in the scientific community read this book, and actually they say, I had this incredible experience, and I believe in synchronicity too, and there is something about our lives and about being loved by a higher